Welcome to the Wheel of Time Diaries. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today you'll see I actually have a green screen for proper video background with the cover art and stuff this time, instead of this just looking like a normal book binge video. That's neither here nor there, but today we are starting our journey through The Gathering Storm, Book 12 of the Wheel of Time, finally starting this final act of the series, and I gotta tell you guys, I am excited, because this book has been incredible so far. To just kind of jump right into like my normal statistics right off the bat. Like I always start these videos talking about how long or how much time I spent reading over the past week, and very often I'll say like however many hours. It's usually between like 6 and 8, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more, kind of depending on how things go. Well, I started this book a week ago at the time that I'm recording this, which is the day before this video comes out. I've read 14 and a half hours of the book. I'm actually halfway through, but for the sake of my own sanity and for time, I'm only going to be covering the first half of what I read today, so a quarter of the book or so. That'll be prologue and chapters 1 through 12. That took me about 8 hours to read over the past week, but again, I read about 14 and a half hours actually, so chapters 13 through 26 are what we're going to cover next week. I'll be recording these two videos back to back. It's just, you know, covering half of an entire Wheel of Time book in one diary. This video would be honestly probably a couple hours long with the way that many of these diaries for the last couple books have been, and that would just be completely unreasonable, and it would also just suck for me to edit, to be honest. So I'm splitting this into two videos. I'm covering the prologue in chapters 1 through 12 today. And yeah, let's start with the spoiler-free impressions of the book so far, my first impressions. And the very first thing is that Brandon Sanderson really understands this series. He really understands these characters, and he understands the tone of what he is writing. And he understands that quite intrinsically. It's not just by pure happenstance. Obviously, he was a fan of the series before he ended up unwittingly ending up being the guy chosen to write the rest of the series. He had spoken multiple times in videos that I've seen before. Like, he's mentioned that he would go back and reread like all of the books, like quite frequently. I think like whenever a new one came out for a long time, and including I think maybe even before he finished writing the series himself, went through all that, plus all of the notes and whatever. And quite frankly, I'm not 100% sure the extent to which the notes that he had for these books like really contributed to what he wrote for the series. But I do know that however much it is, doesn't make much difference, because how much he got done with this, again, he really understands what's going on here. As far as those spoiler-free impressions go, like I was saying, I do think he understands the tone and the quality of this world in such a way that, like, I have basically never, while reading this book, been taken out by anything and wondered, like, I'm not so sure about that one, Sando. Like, this doesn't feel like Wheel of Time to me. Basically everything has felt like Wheel of Time to me, and the only exception to that, and it's the common exception for The Gathering Storm, has been Matt, but even Matt doesn't necessarily feel so out there the way that many other people like kind of tend to make a little bit of a stink about sometimes. I think he's a little bit more expressively exuberant than perhaps the last couple books have led us to believe his character tends to be. And like that could be a valid criticism, but I'm actually a little bit more annoyed by Talmanes in Matt's storyline, actually. And I don't even think any of that is what I've read in this week's reading, actually. I think that's all in next week's reading, and that's only a couple of scenes, really. Every other character so far has come across as very, very genuine and reasonable. Like, I think Sanderson really got these characters, and honestly might even understand a couple of them better than Jordan got to by the end of his work. And like, this is where I'm gonna start to like slander a little bit of like Knife of Dreams, for example. I already talked about in my Knife of Dreams videos multiple times, like, is that book really a return to form? Well, like, by definition it basically is, because it's a lot better than the previous books, and the fact that it like kind of does something and wraps up that entire slog arc storyline that's going on there, like, makes it much more notable than its previous books for very obvious reasons, but if we're talking about a return to form for the Wheel of Time, this is that. This is reminding me in a lot of ways about what it is that I actually enjoyed so much about a lot of the earlier books, and that's in the pacing and the character work, and quite frankly, the fact that every chapter actually serves a purpose. That is something that I've really come to realize while reading this book that Robert Jordan just completely biffed through many of the last like 4 to 5 books, maybe just the last 4 of them, but like there's a lot of structural and pacing and kind of prose bloat issues in those books that I've talked about many different times before, but I didn't really realize or didn't like put my finger on the term to use for it. There's a lot of filler content in those books as well, where like some chapters just aren't important, where if there is something that is being done in some chapters, particularly in like books 9, 10, and 11, the first half of 11 specifically, where if there is something important happening in a chapter, there's not necessarily any reason why that particular thing couldn't have happened elsewhere. Some of the time, that particular thing has already happened elsewhere or will already happen at some point very soon or something along those lines. So you end up with certain redundancies and a lot of scenes that just largely feel like unimportant. They don't do anything. And when you combine that with Robert Jordan's style of having several chapters per POV, or at least per storyline back to back, there's a little bit less inherent urgency to doing the things that the plotline needs to do there, so we just kind of meandered a bit. There's a slight slice of life-esque type of quality to a lot of what was going on within those books. Not slice of life per se, but you kind of understand what I'm saying, where the urgency of the actual storyline, despite covering a very short period of time, just wasn't there because Robert Jordan would just meander with the prose and the scenes not really mattering that much, or having a lot of the more mundane moments stick within those scenes. And there are times and places where this is fine and where this works, but as far as being where we are in the series, like the last battle approaching, all of these major storylines going on, how many plots and POVs we've got in the series by the end of book 11, for instance, there's just too much to justify how much time is being wasted in those books. This book, however, with its heavy hand of editing, I'm sure, which is probably a good bit of why this log arc is what it is because it did not have as much of an editing hand as it needed, or the editing advice was ignored. Whichever one it is, I don't know. It's mere speculation, but I think Robert Jordan probably just ignored a lot of the advice, if he got any at all. Brandon Sanderson couldn't. If this book was going to be published, if any of these books were going to be published, they needed to be like really approved by like everybody. Whereas Robert Jordan probably just kind of got to a place where he was able to do what he wanted and basically nobody was going to push him on it. This book, every chapter matters. If the chapter exists, it is doing something and it is there for a reason. And so that gives a little bit of urgency. And speaking of the urgency point again, there's also the fact of the matter that Sanderson's writing here is switching between POVs quite often. There's not necessarily that a POV switches every single chapter, although through the first half of the book that is true. And it is less so the case that the actual plotline or the storyline being covered switches every single chapter, because that's not necessarily true either. It does still hop around a lot more frequently than the Robert Jordan books did, but the way that they're hopping around and the way the POVs are chosen feels very intentionally crafted. Like I said, not only does every chapter actually exist for a tangible reason that you can point at, to the degree that, like, when I get through reading 6 chapters this morning, for instance, I can go back and take my notes of what happens in every chapter back to back and, like, go through and basically put all the key plot points of each chapter in, just like that, without having to look up wiki, without having to look up a summary, just to make sure I'm not missing something important or I've forgotten something that happened because there was just so much stuff and my brain got overloaded. I don't have to do that because everything's pretty clear and it's relatively concise. The chapters are also shorter. Speaking of shorter, the prologue is only a little over an hour long in this book, as opposed to 4 hours long in the 2 previous books. And not a single chapter has cracked an hour long on its own. And the longer ones are still in the 45-minute range or something like that. The shorter ones are in the 10 to 15-minute range. This pacing of the chapters going back and forth, aside from the POV and the plot switching, jumping quite frequently in a way that I think actually serves the story. And I'll talk on that point a little bit more because I got sidetracked. It works because, again, it reminds me of the earlier books when the chapters were a little bit shorter, when they weren't meandering, when they got in, did the thing they needed to do, and then they moved on. Even if there was a little bit of extra material or, things that certain other people might consider bloat, but I wouldn't. It was fine because like the chapters were still efficient. They were doing what Jordan wanted when he wanted to do them. Whereas a lot of the slog books just didn't really, like it just felt like there wasn't enough efficiency. And I don't necessarily think that the books need to be efficient, but those ones could have been a lot more efficient and they would have been better books because of it. The Gathering Storm doesn't have these issues because there's no bloat, because there's a lot more editing in there that like forces everything to matter, forces those chapters to work. And on the actual content itself, the POV switching and the storyline stuff, again, it's very intentional. Not only is every chapter important, as I've already said a few times, sorry to re-bring up the point. This is just the way my brain is working, speaking off the cuff. I don't have any notes for this portion of the video here. Those chapters matter, but more importantly, the POV from which they are explored matters as well. I have praised in the past some of what Robert Jordan does with some of the POV allocation when he does certain interesting things with it. For example, the beginning of Path of Daggers, I think, it might be A Crown of Swords, I forget. It's one of those two books when we have like 4 or 6 chapters or something like that of Perrin POV, but Perrin's storyline is like, it doesn't do anything in and of itself because Perrin's point of view is being used to look at Rand as he is ruling in Carrion. The purpose of using Perrin's POV at the beginning of that book, whichever one it is, pretty sure it's Crown of Swords actually, because the beginning of Path of Daggers is actually the Bull of the Winds plotline concluding, I think. That might be it. In either case, whichever book it happens in, you use multiple chapters of Perrin POV to actually take a look at Rand, and that was one of my favorite things about whichever book that was. You would think I would remember which book it was, but things run together with the slog arc because the structure of that arc is just so bad. But it was one of my most favorite things. It was one of the most interesting things Jordan had done for a while, was looking at certain characters from other characters' POVs, not just experiencing a plot from the main character of that plot for objective reasons, but specifically to be able to observe some things from different perspectives. So we get a broader view of what's happening and a better understanding of why all of that stuff is happening. This was also a big reason why I loved The Dragon Reborn so much, because after the first 2 books of the series, which were basically all Rand POV, you have basically no Rand POV in The Dragon Reborn. You are forced to explore the ramifications of what him being the Dragon Reborn means, and especially viewing his character implicitly through that angle from all of the other main characters instead of Rand. You have some moments of Rand POV in there, but it's not much, and that is an interesting decision that really works thematically for the series. This book does a lot of things like that. For example, there is a chapter in this week's reading that we will get to that is a Nynaeve POV that is doing nothing for Nynaeve specifically, but is viewing Rand, and views Rand in a way that is actually pretty enlightening beyond his POV. There are multiple moments of this. There's a chapter that I just read today for next week's reading that we'll get to next week, that is a Cadsuane POV that does the same thing, viewing Rand from his POV. After the previous chapter viewing Rand from his own POV, then you go to Cadsuane POV the next chapter, and you get this like very shifting look at Rand's character that is like really impactful and cool. Like there's a lot of this interesting stuff. It's not just that the chapters are doing stuff, it's also that the POVs chosen in some cases are pretty dynamic and diverse. So like just a lot about what Sanderson is doing in The Gathering Storm really works for me. I'm a big fan. And I'm definitely looking forward to reading more and, quite frankly, just going over all of this material. I know this spoiler-free section was long, but I had to go over basically all of that because it was important and relevant to my impressions, my first impressions of the book. I think the book starts off great, has a great prologue, and every chapter has been good. There's one chapter with minor complaints that I have that I've already touched on at this point, but outside of that one minor thing, I've loved everything about this book a lot. And again, it reminds me of the early portions of the series when I really loved the series. Not just that I really enjoyed it overall, but that I loved it. And so I'm loving this book. And yeah, that's all I need to say for the spoiler free at this point. I've already spent more than enough time on it. So one final time, we are covering the prologue and chapters 1 through 12 of the book in here, and it's going to take a while. This video is probably going to be a little bit longer than I wanted, specifically because I spent so long on the spoiler-free, but let's jump into things. But we'll start off just with the prologue. There is a handful of notable scenes in the prologue that were pretty good and pretty interesting, and that kind of set up a couple of storylines that we will get to explore over the next couple weeks worth of reading that I'm looking forward to cover. And again, you know, just as like I said before, the prologue of this book only being an hour and 15 minutes long for me compared to 4 hours for Crossroads of Twilight and Knife of Dreams prologues, that was very satisfying. But yeah, we'll talk about the prologue. The main thing worthy of note is that the opening scene of the prologue is really, really good. I think it's the only scene where there's no characters in there that are recognizable to us. And it might even be the case that nobody in this prologue POV becomes actually relevant to the story, and it's more so just to kind of set up for the tone of stuff that's going on. Maybe these characters come back, I don't know. But you have a farmer named Renaud Fanoir who watches as a storm gathers, like the title of the book, haha. The storm gathers above his kind of failing farmland. We get notes throughout this book specifically that, like, though spring has kind of come on, the spring greens isn't really happening. You know, grass is kind of not green, as you can see actually in this video here, as the artwork depicts. And like crops and stuff aren't really growing and doing stuff like that. So you still have the Dark One's touch on the world, even though the Bowl of the Winds helped repair a lot of what was wrong with the weather. Spring still isn't springing right. So that is something that Renaud Fanoir is noticing when a relative neighbor of his, a blacksmith, or a smith in general named Thulin, arrives, like delivering eggs to this other family, and Thulin and his family are like leaving. This is something that kind of puts Renaud off a little bit. Like, why are you leaving? This is weird. What are we doing here? And they basically say that the storm signifies the last battle is coming, a theme that is recurring throughout this book. The last battle is coming, and Thulin is going on to meet it. He's going up into the Blight to go serve as a smithy, probably for the armies or something, to help wherever and however he can against the last battle, basically. And he basically encourages that Renaud should also do so. And Renaud seems to take that suggestion pretty seriously. This opening scene for the prologue was awesome. I loved it. Set the tone for the book. Great. And got me right back into this world. Again, Sanderson definitely understands this world to such a degree that I was able to go right back into it and be immersed right back into it without any issue at all. This opening prologue scene did that. But now we're going to talk about a couple of scenes that kind of set up some stuff that we will talk about a little bit later. The next scene is Shanshan named Felendre is allowed to return to Abu Dar by Rand, of course. This was part of, you know, kind of the bargaining, negotiating that Rand was trying to make, that like he doesn't hold what happened with Semiraj burning his hand off and that ambush, that entire mess with Suroth and everything. He doesn't hold that against the Shanshan. He doesn't hold that against Tuon or the Daughter of the Nine Moons, and he still wishes for a meeting. So he is sending the Abu Dar that were like kind of captured in that battle back to the city so that they can, you know, just know that like he's not hostile and he still wants a meeting with them. So he's sending Felendre back to do that, to give the message to Tuon that he still wants to meet with her. That is what that scene does, and we get some continuation of that with the next scene, which sees Tylee Kiergan, who of course is the Seanchan general who fought alongside Perrin to free Zareen in the last couple of books. Tylee Kiergan is also returning to Abu Dar here in the prologue following that confrontation that she just took part in alongside Perrin, and she is kind of thinking about considering that she should probably be allying with these people rather than fighting against them. This is a consideration of hers and one that she intends to take to the throne, and upon getting pretty close to Abu Dar, her and her people there are ambushed by a bunch of Trollocs that have somehow managed to make it past their defenses. Again, we will be mentioning this a little bit later. I forget if that will be in this week's reading or next week's. I think it'll probably be next week's, but we shall see. The next scene is one of Graendal, one of the Forsaken, having been summoned to observe Messiana and Demandred, having to report to Moradin. So another one of these Forsaken meetings, except that Graendal isn't inherently involved with it, but she is witnessing as Messiana and Demandred have to report to Moradin kind of things that are going on. She learns that Semirhage has been captured by Rand, and also that Demandred does indeed have he has managed to obtain some level of leadership wherever it is that he is kind of hiding out at, because she has had up to this point basically no idea what Demandred is doing. She wants to know what the other Forsaken are plotting so she can kind of like move around all of that, and being allowed to observe this reporting gives her a little bit of an idea that like Demandred's got something going on. He is leading somewhere. He does have an army, or he does command armies that he's able to use for the purposes of the Dark One. And that's good information for her. That is useful to her. Moradin reveals that, like, yeah, I let you observe this because I think that you will be useful. Moradin essentially commands her to keep Rand intact. Like, he says, like, nobody's allowed to kill Rand, basically, except for the Dark One. And so he's like, you know, you're allowed to go back to Erdaman. Your job in Erdaman is to not let him make peace. Keep everything unstable there as much as you can. Rand can't be allowed to take control there, but do not kill him. So he gives that command to her basically directly again. The next scene is another Iturralde scene. Iturralde, of course, is Eredamani general that we've seen some scene from in the last like 2 or 3 prologues or something like that, pushing back against the Seanchan invasion through the Almoth Plains and in Eredaman, of course. And Iturralde, specifically in the prologue here, watches over a little assault of his, a guised ambush assault of his that goes against a massive Seanchan army in Eredaman, where he's vastly outnumbered, but manages to have a leg up and succeeds in a battle here. But he watches over as that battle commences in the prologue. And the last scene of the prologue is Massima. This is the most like plot directly related one of the prologue, ironically enough. And by plot related, I mean like, you know, something that could otherwise have been in another chapter, but we'll talk a little bit more about the structure of the prologue here in a moment. But you have Massima, of course, the prophet, has been deceived, believing Rand having commanded him to kill Perrin. It seems like he has had somebody visiting him in his dreams, giving him commands to kill Perrin, convincing him that Perrin is a dark friend. This kind of goes along with the what's his name, Aram or whatever, the once tinker who picked up the sword and at the end of the last book tried to kill Perrin and got killed himself, having been convinced by Massima that Perrin was actually a dark friend. Massima has been convinced that Perrin is a dark friend by Rand, quote unquote, but almost certainly one of the Forsaken in actuality. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's like all but confirmed, because who else would have been able to do that? But Massima kind of reflects on this following all of everything that happened at the end of the last book. He reflects on his losses at Malden. He has basically no men. He has like a handful of men left, basically. And in this prologue scene, he and his few remaining men are snuck upon by Zareen and her personal faithful followers, and it leaves them all dead. So Massima is now dead, including all of his people. Zareen plans to keep this hidden from Perrin, but this is something that happens. So a couple things to note about the prologue, like just kind of generally how it's structured. One of the things that I really like about this prologue is that a lot of these scenes are directly related to the main plot in that they set up a lot of the storylines that we're going to follow in this book. I'm pretty sure almost every one of these scenes has been followed up on directly in the book so far. The opening scene is kind of an outlier because I'm not sure what relevance that's going to have to the series at large in general at this point. And then the Graendal scene also hasn't really been followed up on either at this point. Haven't really seen any of that happen in Eredamon. I'm 99% certain though that we'll see some follow-up to that in the back half of this book, just based off of where Rand's storyline is currently set. But again, all that stuff is what we'll talk about later. But like, all of these scenes are relevant enough to the main storyline that I can connect where they are. I mean, Massima's the most obvious example there because Massima was part of that storyline. But one of the things that makes this still feel like a prologue to me, some of my complaints about some of Robert Jordan's prologues, as of recent anyway, is that they're really long, and some of those scenes are just normal chapters. Like, they could have been put into a normal chapter because they're main story POVs. They don't feel like prologue material. There's nothing about them that feels like setting up the book. They're just regular chapters. Where the prologue-worthy scenes that are setting up a book or are otherwise like not really the main storyline or something along those lines, those scenes have always been really good in Robert Jordan's prologues. But the last few of them have included stuff that's just like, why is this in the prologue? Why is our prologue 3 or 4 hours long to read with some of these scenes that should just be like chapter 1 and 2, for example? This prologue goes back to being a little bit more simple and utilizes no main story POVs to do so, and where the main story even is concerned to some degree, depending on the plotline, like Massima at the end, you're using non-standard POVs to do it. This might be the first time Massima has had a POV in the series, and if it isn't, he hasn't had much POV. He's not a primary POV like Zareen or Perrin would be. If you were to have had that Massima being killed scene from Zareen's POV, that would have not felt like a prologue scene to me, and it probably would have bothered me a little bit. It's a weird thing to get hung up on, I know, but like, if you're doing a prologue, like, it needs to have a reason to be a prologue instead of a chapter 1, and this prologue succeeds on that. And because basically all these scenes set up something substantial, it felt extra worth it. You know, even though the first scene, I'm not sure what that farmer or the smithy, how they're going to fit into the story, if at all, it set up the tone of the book and of the world as it exists in this book in a way that was impactful and meaningful. And all of the other scenes were relevant enough to the main story, like I said, for me to be able to see where they fit anyway. But more than that, were also generally structured in such a way that's just like, okay, I'm 99% sure now that all of these scenes are going to be directly followed up on in the main book. So there's still secondary stuff. You're just kind of laying the very foundation of what all these plot lines are going to do. And some of those have been satisfied to some degree so far. And that is really, really cool. Definitely a big fan of all of that. Oh, and actually one last little note that I wanted to include here at the end of my coverage for the prologue before we jump into the main story, because I was initially not going to include this rant here, but there's no other video or something like that where it would really make sense to put it instead, so I'm just going to put it here. Maybe I could do it in the ugly of the review and make that ugly a spoiler section, but no, it bears actually mentioning. I guess if we want to be completely honest, there is one minor complaint that I do have about this prologue, and that is the decision to actually kill Massima off in it. Even though I think it works well as far as the structure of the prologue and what it kind of sets up for this storyline in the future, from an objective measurement of the series writ large, this decision is like kind of both a good thing and a bad thing. The good thing about it is that, like, cool, I don't have to deal with any of this shit that we've been dragging on for 4 or 5 books now anymore. But on the other hand, it's also a really bad decision because it proves just how useless Perrin and his plotline has been through the entire Slog arc. Just to try to make this as concise as possible, Perrin's storyline kinda sucks for a lot of these last handful of books, and that is because it's not really doing anything, and what it does takes way too long to do it. Case in point, the entire reason that Saving Zareen needs to take 3 books is because Robert Jordan had zero fucking clue what he was doing with his plotline in the first place, and so basically did nothing with it, to the point that 4 chapters of Winter's Heart, is something you could basically explain in a paragraph and move on, and nothing of value would be lost. That is how little there is to this plotline. But to be more accurate about it, the Saving Zareen plotline of books 9 through 11 is a subplot, actually, because what that plotline is supposed to be doing starts in book 8, when Perrin is sent off by Rand to go after Massima and bring Massima the Prophet to him. And so they do that in book 8. It works. Like, they get to the end of the book and Perrin's able to convince Massima. It's just like, you need to come with me, basically. Like, the dragon wants to talk to you, so come with me. And so the prophet he relents. Massima relents. It's just like, okay, fine, I'll go with you. I don't want to, but fine, we'll do it. But I refuse to go through magic portals, and that is a condition that he makes. And Perrin's just like, okay, whatever, I don't care. And then he goes back and discovers that Zareen is missing, and that becomes a subplot that takes 3 books to complete, where the plot is supposed to be taking Massima back to Rand, but it's actually just about saving Zareen, because that's the only thing that they have to do at this point, and that's kind of annoying. And notice that in the middle of that subplot, Massima decides to go through the magic portals anyway, solely for the purpose of saving Zareen. If you're going to have him relent and go through the magic portals, even though his condition was to not do it, just send him directly to Rand through the magic portals. Just do it. Just get that over with, and then go back and get Zareen later. That way that plotline is actually done, right? No, Jordan never did that, because he doesn't know what to do with Perrin at all. So this doesn't happen, and so the entire point of this plotline, it's literally addressed in one of these chapters. I think it's one of the chapters from next week's reading, actually. One of the scenes with Perrin where he kind of acknowledges this in his head, or in a conversation with Zareen or something, where it's literally, and sorry, like, this spoils sort of a scene from next week's reading, but this goes to the point of killing off Massima in the prologue here. The entire point of getting Massima was to bring him to the Prophet. The entire point of that subplot was to be a subplot within the storyline, and now it's done. Now Massima's just dead. You don't have anything to do with it. It's over. So what was the fucking point of Perrin being gone for the last 4 fucking books, aside from just growing a little bit, getting rid of the axe, and deciding that he needs to take more responsibility as a person, and not to avoid making decisions? Like, these 3, like, minor things that could have been done, A, a lot quicker, or B, in literally pretty much any other circumstance that wasn't a subplot that drew out along 3 books. This is all that Perrin's plotline does, from books 8 through 11. Like, 4 entire books, the entire purpose of the plotline, gone. Just like that in the prologue of book 12. I don't mind it a whole ton, from the sense of, like, it's a fresh start, it's a new beginning. Now an author in Brandon Sanderson who actually likes Perrin and understands what Perrin is supposed to be and who he's supposed to be, is just taking him in a completely new direction, not being bogged down by this character and this plotline that has taken 4 books to do literally nothing with, aside from, okay, I agree to meet Rand, and that's it. I get that Sanderson kind of needed to do something, and that Robert Jordan didn't leave very many notes for Perrin's character for Sanderson to work from. So again, like, it makes sense from some perspective to be like, yeah, it makes sense to let's just get rid of all this baggage and start with something new. So from that sense, I understand it. But from, again, the context of the last several books and what has come before in the series and what there is to actually cover, this is bullshit. You wasted time. Jordan had no idea what he was doing with Perrin, and that is an objective failing of the series. Like, it is actually extremely aggravating, and I hate it. So while I understand the decision to do things this way, I respect it and kind of like it in some degree because, again, you're getting rid of the baggage. It also just proves, once again, finalizes it. It's the final nail in the coffin that this plotline through the last 4 books was shit, absolute dog shit, completely worthless. I am swearing a lot in this particular section of the video when I basically never swear in videos in general because it is stupid and pointless. Just the most pointless plotline, quite literally, because by the time you get through the subplot, the main reason the plot exists in the first place is gone in an instant, just like that. It's just really, really stupid. But anyway, I'm going to move on and actually go into the rest of the recording because I'm recording this section after the fact. So have fun with the rest of the video. I'm a lot more positive through the rest of the video. So that is the prologue. And now that I've spent 15 minutes talking about all of that, let's try to plow through chapters 1 through 12. This is going to be a mess and it's probably going to take a long time. I'm sorry. And with the POV switching, this is going to be the main problem that I have with the POV switching and the storyline switching, is that it's going to be somewhat difficult to do all of these efficiently, like to go through like different storylines and stuff, especially since sometimes the order of events as they are revealed in the chapter order is actually kind of important because of information that is developed between the two of them, even if they're different storylines or different POVs. So like, I'm not sure how I'm going to actually do this, but we'll give it a shot. But we'll start off with chapter 1, which is a Rand POV, basically. I mean, it starts off with like a good setup to the world. Again, Sanderson understanding the tone of the world. It actually starts off with like kind of an omniscient narration that's like a wind blowing from the White Tower to Aerodamon, where it meets Rand and impossibly blows in 2 directions at once. You spend like 3 or 4 pages with this sort of omniscient narration following the wind from Tarvalon all the way to Aerodamon, and like that was really cool stylistic decision. I actually really liked this. But in general, chapter 1 is basically a Rand POV. He considers upon the last battle, you know, something that he is thinking a lot about for obvious reasons. He is considering this while he and all of his people are in Aerodamon because he needs stuff to happen here. This is going to be probably one of the major fronts where the last battle happens, is in this area. So Rand thinks about that, and he's also considering some other stuff going on in his life, such as Semirhage being held, and the fact that he's basically not allowed the Aes Sedai to torture her in trying to interrogate her because he doesn't want women hurt or killed. That is still something that he wants. And even though Semirhage is forsaken, he's like, no, you hold her, try to interrogate her, but you're not allowed to torture her. That's where I draw the line. So he's thinking about that. He is also wondering if Graendal is here in Aerodamon, kind of like we learned a little bit about in the prologue there, because I believe he got word from someone at some point, or some memories from Lews Therin. I forget the exact details, but there's some reason why he knows that Graendal was in Aerodamon at least at one point relatively recently, and he's wondering if she is still here and what he is supposed to do about her, if she is here and if she is sowing chaos here, and more importantly, like how he is supposed to like bind the world together according to prophecy. So he's still having this larger thoughtful consideration thing that he tends to do. He's brooding a little bit. You have a moment in the chapter where Semirhage's interrogators, so some of the Aes Sedai who have been interrogating her, they come in to speak with Rand, and they actually ask about turning the Forsaken into the White Tower directly instead of keeping her with them, because there's something a little bit like dangerous inherently about keeping her with them instead of having her locked up in a little bit more of an official capacity. But Rand obviously shuts down that idea because, well, you know, he doesn't know whether he trusts the White Tower, and between the White Tower and the rebel camp, like, what are you supposed to do with that? So he's like, no, I don't really want to deal with the Aes Sedai in that way right now. Like, let's just not keep her here. You're going to continue to interrogate her. He also suddenly hears Lews Therin in his head lament about Aes Sedai specifically for not helping him assault Shaiol Ghul, is that how that's pronounced? Whatever. The when he was trying to lock up the Dark One in his own age, Rand finally hears Lews Therin actually talk about this. This is something that he's tried to have Lews Therin speak to him in his head about, tried to ask him about. It's just like, what am I supposed to do to lock up the Dark One? What am I supposed to do to defeat him? And Lews Therin has basically like ignored that up to this point. So like Lews Therin suddenly giving him some information, just like, man, the Aes Sedai, they did not help me with my assault when I did that, startles Rand into basically replying to him out loud, demanding an answer, which makes him appear mad to the Aes Sedai, so that's kind of funny. But this is also a thread that's going to continue on through the first half of this book, with Rand kind of wondering about that, and Lews Therin like eking out a little bit of information a couple of times, and that's something that comes to be pretty interesting. For the most part, in this week's reading, chapters 1 through 12, we kind of have like two major storylines going on. You have the stuff going on in and around the White Tower, and then you have the stuff going on in and around Rand's POV. So I'm going to try to do this as much as I can, focusing on Rand's POV here since we started with that. So that's actually going to have us skip to chapter 3 for the moment, where we have an Aviendha POV, since she's in Aerodemon. She's in this area because she and some of the other Aiel are now in Aerodemon, as Rand directed them to go to, since the Aiel are supposed to help basically secure and bring stability to Aerodemon, which Greyndal was told not to let happen, but that is what the Aiel are basically here to do. Aviendha talks with some of the Wise Ones as well about some of what's going on with Rand. She talks with Ami specifically about her worry over Rand. They also talk a little bit about her intent to marry Rand, which is an interesting point. And then the Wise Ones at the end of that chapter give Aviendha some humiliating punishments for something that she has no idea why. She has no idea why she's being punished in pretty severe ways and forced to do basically menial tasks. And this is something that we'll see develop and come to a head further along the storyline. So that wasn't directly Rand's storyline per se, but it was Aviendha here in Aerodemon that does kind of intersect with Rand a little bit as we move on a little bit into chapter 5 specifically, where we have a couple of POVs, one from Rand and one from Cadsuane. Chapter 5 sees Rand greeting some sea folk as they arrive with regards to his agreement with them to bring supplies to Aerodemon, like he basically made them agree. I think in the last book was what he did. Hareen, specifically of the sea folk, talks to him a little bit, says that she was basically punished a bit when she went to meet with some higher ups of the sea folk in the last book. She was basically punished for the bargain that she made with Rand because she did not do a good enough job in the sea folks' opinion, basically. They also have a little bit more like not personal conversation, but some interesting questions back and forth going on here. In fact, one loose thread so far that I had forgotten about a little bit. Rand asks Hareen specifically how the sea folk treat male channelers, and he promises to answer a question for her in return for her answering this question, because that's one of those things that Hareen is just like, that's not something that you need to know, but Rand's like, I will answer any question for you if you just answer me this one question. And so he learns from Hareen that men who can channel in the sea folk are implicitly killed. You know, they are either stranded on an island if they choose the less honorable way to go. They are left on a deserted island to basically just die there, or they are forced to jump overboard, basically, which is considered the more honorable path. So, in essence, men who can channel are just killed amongst the sea folk. And he tells her that the sea folk need to stop doing that because now men can't go mad from channeling because he has cleansed saidin. And Hareen, like basically everybody else, is a little bit doubtful of this. You know, there's a good reason to be a bit skeptical, at least a little bit skeptical about saidin being cleansed, because it's been so long that it's had this taint going on that people are like, I don't know about that. Should we trust that? I don't know if I do. And obviously the only people who can attest to saidin being cleansed are men who can channel. So like that's kind of going to be a level of trust that is that dynamic. The level of trust regarding that is probably something that's going to be explored a good little bit through the rest of the series. I would anticipate, at least in these next couple books, as we're continuing to develop onwards towards the last battle. But in either case, Rand did get this answer from Hareen. Hareen opts out of asking her question and saving it for later. So that's a loose thread. We'll probably have Hareen show back up in the narrative at some point to ask whatever question she has of Rand at some point later, and that'll probably be something relatively major whenever that happens. I would anticipate that if we have something like that happen, it would probably be like from Hareen's POV, specifically to kind of get her insight into whatever question that is, why she's asking that question, and how important the answer actually is. So that'll be something interesting to see whenever that occurs, but I'm not sure when that's going to happen. In either case, this scene is broken up by Aiel arriving to meet with Rand. Of course, you know, like, man, what are their names? I'm forgetting their names off the top of my head, like Ruark, I think, and some of the others who have come to meet with Rand since they were sent to Erdaman. They have arrived, and so Rand intends to meet with them. The next POV is Cadsuane observing within the chapter. It's still chapter 5, by the way. Cadsuane observing Semirhage continuing to be interrogated. They're trying to get information about Graendal because obviously, Rand wants to know if Graendal is in Erdaman and what her plans are here. If Semirhage knows anything, they want to know. But, you know, Semirhage is not answering questions. You know, they're trying to interrogate her. They're trying to question her. They're not allowed to torture her. And Cadsuane, within Semirhage's defiance, her unwillingness to answer questions, Cadsuane recognizes little bits of herself in Semirhage, which kind of off-puts her a little bit. You know, it's unsettling to her. She has the prior lament about not being able to torture Semirhage because, you know, inflicting pain is a good way to get people to talk in some cases. But Cadsuane also in the scene realizes that torturing Semirhage would be pretty ineffective and useless because Semirhage is like the queen of torturing people. Like, she knows more about pain than anybody else. That's what she is known for as a Forsaken. So doing that is probably not going to help. And because she recognizes little bits of herself in Semirhage, she has to wonder, like, okay, how are we going to get this bitch to talk to us, right? And so she considers, how would I break myself? Like, if someone were to break me and get me to talk, how would that go? Like, what could break me? Because, again, she recognizes little bits of herself in some of the ways of defiance and treating some of the other Aes Sedai. She recognizes some of that between herself and Semirhage, so she has to get a little bit uncomfortable, wondering how she's actually going to get Semirhage to talk. And this is something we'll see again come back up a little bit later. I can't remember if the scene that I'm thinking of is in this week's reading or next week's, so I will save that for next week. Just on account of the convergence of a couple of POVs happening in chapter 6, not convergence of POVs, just the combination of POVs that occur in chapter 6. This will actually be a good point to switch gears a little bit more to what's happening in the White Tower a little bit, so we will circle back around to chapter 2, and we'll cover chapters 2, 4, and then 6 before we move on to 7. So chapter 2 sees us in the White Tower with an Egwene POV, and right off the bat, before I even say anything that happens here, the White Tower POV is goated. I absolutely love everything that's happening here. If you've been paying attention or been following along to any of the coverage that I've done with the Wheel of Time over the last couple of books, basically, I've realized that Egwene is one of my favorite POVs at this point. She might be my favorite active storyline, at least of the Slog arc, for example. I think just most of my favorite things that have been happening, many of my favorite moments and chapters have been within Egwene's POV, and I gotta say, basically that holds true in Gathering Storm as well. Just all of her material here has been really, really enjoyable, really great material, and chapter 2 kind of continues this trend. Of course, in book 11, at the end of book 10, we saw Egwene get captured by the White Tower, and 11 sees her in captivity there. And there are a few chapters where she's having to be defiant, both to Elaida and to all the other Aes Sedai. Not defiant in like a childish way, but in a way of like, I'm the Amerlin seat. I'm not going to bow down to you people. I'm not going to submit myself to you guys because I am the rightful Amerlin seat at this point, and therefore I have authority. So she's trying to prove that strength, prove that defiance, and that power powerful way, like a legitimately powerful and meaningful way, and also doing that while trying to convince the Aes Sedai of the various different Ajas to just associate with each other, that coming together, working together, being seen with each other is a good thing that will start to heal the tower a little bit, because Elaida being in power in the Amyrlin seat in the actual White Towers, not really working. It is seeming to be failing, and Egwene, what she sees as her job is to basically try to convince the other Aes Sedai of this, is to convince them that yes, like, this is not good, see the damage that Elaida has done to the tower, and heal, like, try to heal it. If, we have to get rid of Elaida somehow, then so be it. But for the moment, you guys at least need to be working together as Ajas. Like, the split of the tower and all of the Ajas not trusting each other is an actively bad thing for Aes Sedai, so we need to repair that. That is an important goal for Egwene. And that is something that we got to see start to build up in Book 11. My favorite chapter, maybe, of Book 11 was one particular where Egwene really started to show this defiance, in light of being sent to the Mistress of Novices to be punished quite frequently, multiple times a day even, her showing her defiance here and making headway with the other novices and with some of the other girls in the tower, some of the women in the tower a little bit, noticing that she is putting up a resistance by not submitting herself to some of the other women, being noticed. That was a very, very great chapter within Book 11. And Book 12 here, Gathering Storm, has multiple moments of Egwene POV doing a similar thing. Chapter 2 is definitely of note. Egwene has just received, at the very beginning of this chapter, regular punishment from Sylviana for whatever it is, because she is basically in the Mistress of Novices quarters all day, every day, basically, continually getting punished for anything and everything. But the Mistress of Novices, Sylviana, does seem to be reacting to Egwene's resilience in light of all of this quite well, actually. Egwene leaves to be given her fork root afterwards, and, asks her retinue if the division of the Ajas saddens them, and she is given, like, she has the confidence to ask this question because of Sylviana's reaction. Sylviana's like starting to like relent a little bit and be like, well, I'm still going to do my duty. It is my job to punish you when these people say you need to be punished, so I'm going to do that. But Sylviana, like, kind of implicitly respects Egwene for her, like, I guess, courage in the face of all this, the fact that she is so resilient. You could consider it to be a bit of a obstinance or stubbornness, but there's a little bit of that Sylviana almost starts to respect a bit. You get to see that little crack show in this chapter, and you get to see a little bit of that start to show a little bit elsewhere here too. Like I said, Egwene leaves to be given her fork root and given her retinue of Red Aja that kind of guide her around the tower, or that follow her around the tower, so she's not getting into trouble, basically. She is able to confront them and basically be like, hey, doesn't the split of the Ajas here sadden you a little bit? And they seem to react somewhat positively to that sentiment, in that, yeah, it does seem to be something that they are worried and concerned about. So Egwene's like trying to make headway here with as many Aes Sedai as she can. In the chapter, she is forced to attend Elaida for dinner, and in this scene was really fun. Elaida basically speaks to Miadani, because Miadani is also there for dinner. So Egwene is attending Elaida and Miadani for dinner. Of course, we know Miadani is one of the Saladar Aes Sedai, one of the rebel Aes Sedai who was sent to the White Tower to spy on it and to send information back, but she was discovered, and Elaida knows that she is one of the rebels and has decided to keep her close, specifically to, like, forget the specific reasons why Elaida keeps Miadani close, maybe to, like, keep an eye on her, or maybe to try to feed her, like, false information or something so that her spy reports are wrong. I forget the exact details, but there's a reason why Elaida, like, chooses to keep Miadani close despite knowing that she was a spy. But anyway, so they are having dinner together, and Egwene is attending them. The Amyrlin kind of, like, speaks offhand a little bit about the potential of adding a fourth oath to the Aes Sedai, and that fourth oath being fealty to the Amyrlin specifically, which is, like, a super sketch. That is a show of power that is not great, not a good idea, Elaida, and Egwene is pretty outraged by this consideration. She's pretty outraged by Elida in general, and in order to not display this outrage openly, she like basically forces herself to spill some of the soup that she is attending to on an expensive rug, which sends Elida into an absolute fury. She she goes to try to get servants to take care of this because it is an expensive rug. It is soup that was spilled on it. You know, she's upset. But while cleaning the rug, because Miodani and Egwene both start to clean the rug immediately, Egwene uses this moment to tell Miodani to call upon her so that they can discuss the situation of the tower directly. Because as is, Egwene has been using like some other third-party contact within the tower to talk to the spies, to talk to those Saladar spies, like indirectly, but this is her chance to talk to me and Donnie directly, be like, hey, call me to you and we can talk about this, because generally sisters of any particular Aja don't enter other Aja's quarters. They're not allowed to enter the quarters of another color of Aja, and that means that the Red Aja that are attending Egwene all of the time aren't really allowed to enter the quarters of other colors. So if a specific Aes Sedai has a lesson to teach Egwene or something, given her novicehood, if one of those sisters calls upon Egwene, Egwene is allowed to go into those quarters and do that thing, and the Red Aja can't follow her. So she can have secret conversations with people. She wants Miodani to do this for her, like call upon me, make some pretense to call upon me, and we can talk about what's going on in the tower directly. And she tells her to do this. Miodani relents and agrees to do it. And following this, Elida, after getting some other help, basically tells Egwene to leave and go get more punishment from Sylviana for this oversight for spilling the soup. And Egwene goes. She returns to Sylviana. She realizes that the tower is heading to deposing Elida already, and her job is to keep it together in the meantime. During her punishment, she does like kind of laugh in defiance of it because she realizes this while she's being punished, and she convinces Sylviana that it is useless, that this pain that she is experiencing is useless compared to the pain of seeing the tower split. And this is basically what convinces Sylviana that like Egwene's got something worth respecting in here. That's really interesting stuff. But now we shall see chapter 4, which again isn't White Tower or Egwene related directly per se. It is just that it is a Gawain POV. There have been a few POVs of this so far in what I've read. Gawain and his younglings are scouting the rebel Aes Sedai camp. They are doing this, of course, under orders from Elida, basically. And Gawain laments being pitted against his one-time mentor, Gareth Bryne, from Andor. You know, this was once somebody who trained him personally, and he doesn't like that he is now being set against this rebel Aes Sedai camp for that reason. He has splitting tensions isn't the word that I'm looking for. He has splitting commitments to different people, his agreements, his commitments to different people. Those aren't the terms. What's the term I'm looking for? I don't remember. But anyway, he is now certain that Elida is basically just trying to keep him occupied or otherwise trying to kill him. So he's kind of uncertain how to feel about his position amongst the younglings at this point. And this chapter will become a little bit more important a little bit later. But that does take us into chapter 6, where we do have a couple more White Tower POVs again. One of those being Leanne losing hope in her prison cell in the tower. One time in this chapter, you know, being visited by Egwene, where a bubble of corruption basically turns parts of her cell and bars suddenly into like wax, nearly swallowing her. This is another thematic recurring thing within the Gathering Storm, is a lot of these chapters featuring some manner of bubble of evil coming up. So obviously that lead up to the last battle is still there. That is still an important plot point. That is still happening. So that happens. That nearly swallows her. Egwene returns to the novice quarters, having met with Leanne here, experiencing this bubble of evil. And when she returns to the novice quarters, she also finds that like half of the brown Aja wing of the tower has literally been switched with half of the novice quarters, basically. So this bubble of evil didn't just like turn part of the ground to wax over Leanne. It was like literally parts of the White Tower have switched and has not fixed itself. So the bubbles of evil are becoming a little bit more apparent. But the other part of Chapter 6 that is worth noting, and that takes us a little bit back more towards the Rand POV once again, is the very first scene of Chapter 6, actually, which is Iturralde again. Returning from the prologue. Like I said, this scene is actually paid off within the book early on. Iturralde confronts the Shan Chan general that he just defeated in the scene that we saw him overlooking in the prologue. He explains how he was able to get his 50,000 soldiers to be able to trick and defeat 150,000 of the Shan Chan soldiers. Like I said, massively outnumbered, but he does win it. This scene, he explains how he was able to do it. He takes the general's head, and he knows that Surath will strike with impossible force in retaliation because they know that trick. He's not going to be able to pull that trick off again. And he basically knows he's fighting a losing battle at this point. It's kind of unfortunate. But because he does know that he's fighting a losing battle, he's like, I'm just going to accept this. I was able to get this big defeat. I'm going to take the general's head. And yeah, that's cool. So Iturralde has that scene. And the reason why I switched over to the plot line over here is because here very soon we're going to actually have in Chapter 7 a little bit more of the Addendum plotline with Rand's side of things going on again, and a little bit of POV that we can talk about here. But first, we're going to talk about something that I mentioned in the spoiler-free section, actually, is that Nynaeve is the POV for at least part of Chapter 7, if not the entirety of Chapter 7. Where she is out and about. She's learning various accepted weaves because she, like some of the other, rebel Aes Sedai who were raised directly to being Aes Sedai by Egwene directly, despite not having gone through the testing. Nynaeve is like trying to gain legitimacy amongst some of the other Aes Sedai that are around her. And one of the ways of doing this is by learning the weaves that the accepted have to learn in order to do the testing in the first place. So that, like, if Nynaeve knows the weaves, that maybe that'll gain her a little bit more respect or a little bit more legitimacy in the eyes of some of the other Aes Sedai. So, like, she's trying to learn some of this, but in the midst of learning this in the chapter, she does see Cadsuane out and about amongst the Addendum camp, moving quickly away somewhere, and so she quickly decides to go leave and try to find Cadsuane. She knows that Cadsuane's doing something urgent, so she does walk out to try to find her, whatever that urgent thing is she wants in on. And Nynaeve feels some channeling somewhere off in the distance and goes to follow it and finds an Aiel tent being set up where she finds Rand within it. Cadsuane follows and enters the tent shortly thereafter. Davrin Bashir is here, and a couple of the Aiel are there, with the ones that arrived to give Rand information about some of the things that are going on. Rand is pretty impatient for results in bringing order to Addendum. He asks the Aiel basically as a means to bring peace and stability to the country. He asks for the Addendum to basically kidnap the Council of Merchants, which are like basically the ruling class of Addendum underneath the king, even though the king is in hiding or dead. They don't really know, but he asks them to kidnap the Council of Merchants so that they can all together come to vote for a new king, because Rand doesn't actually intend to rule in Addendum. He doesn't care for that. He just needs there to be stability, and he wants the merchants to actually vote for somebody who will be able to do that, and so he wants the merchants. He asks the Aiel to get them for him. Meanwhile, he does intend to take control of the cities and have them move inland, basically having the Aiel do this. It's like, you already have control of a little bit of the country, just continue to move inland, take control of a lot more of what's going on here, and offer safety and security to the Damani people, and they will, flock to the cities. Like, when they know it's safe, just under this temporary guard, you'll be okay. And the way that Rand plans to make this work is that he is going to go confront Iturralde as a general, and have some of Iturralde's men basically stay behind in Addendum to help the Aiel in all of these various different spots, so that the Wetlanders here, as the Aiel call them, so that the Wetlanders have somewhere to flock. It's just like, oh yeah, there are legitimate people from Addendum. There are legitimate Damani people here still in ruling positions or in control of the cities to some degree. It's not just the Aiel over here, so they might feel some measure extra safety that way. But Rand needs some of the Eredamani people to actually do that, and he intends to actually confront Iturralde about it. And that's going to take us into chapter 10, where this meeting actually happens. Iturralde prepares for one last defense in a steading against the Seanchan in chapter 10, where their Damani will obviously be limited a little bit, where they will have some advantage that they won't have elsewhere because of the Aiel in Erdogan. Iturralde has learned that there are Aiel here, so he can't really retreat as much as he wanted to. He knows that the massive Seanchan forces coming for him are basically going to be one last stand if he stays where he's at, or he can buy a few days and have a worse chance at a one last stand. So he basically intends to just stay in a steading where he's at and just fight. But suddenly a messenger appears and brings Rand to Iturralde, and Rand requests the Damani aid in doing this thing that I just mentioned, but more importantly, he wants Iturralde and his army to go to the borderlands to guard against some stuff going on in Saldea, I believe it is, the westmost country of the borderlands, because the borderlander armies are like down by Camelin, obviously, like they're just abandoned their post by the Blight for some reason. And Rand wants a reliable army to secure the borderlands, and so he's like, hey, I would like you to do this thing. I don't intend to control Eredamon. I just want some of your people to help the Aiel, bring stability to the country here, while your army goes to the borderlands and kind of takes care of things there, and that gets you out of this immediate pickle with the Seanchan. And more importantly, I ran to the Dragon Reborn. I am going to talk to the Seanchan, and I promise you that they will not invade. I will get the Seanchan to not enter Eredamon. I'll get them to leave Eredamon, whichever one the technicality is. I will make sure that Eredamon is safe and under your people's rule, not mine. I don't intend to control Eredamon personally. I just want you to, in basically payment for this, help guard the borderlands. And Iturralde, crazily enough, agrees to do this. We get to see that Ta'veren effect, where he basically agrees to do that. Rand proves that he is the Dragon Reborn in this discussion. The way that he is able to convince Iturralde to do this is by saying, I have a gateway. I can transfer all of your army to do this thing, right now, basically. And I will prove that I have the power to do this, that I wield Saidin, that I am the Dragon Reborn if we exit the steading over here and I can make the gateway. And they do that. He proves himself. Iturralde agrees. Bing, bam, boom. Chapter done. It was a really great chapter. I actually really enjoyed that material. And so you get the agreement between Rand and Iturralde. Just really enjoyed that. Quite frankly, I enjoyed having the last few prologues of the series contain a scene from Iturralde's POV, building up this general who's doing great, if not impossible things, and having this kind of implicit buildup of this character happening in the prologues, but otherwise not appear anywhere until now he's necessary for the main plot. Honestly, really satisfying build-up, and so far the execution of his character in The Gathering Storm has been satisfying to me. I am a fan. But that is going to take us into Chapter 11, which does basically continue this Eredamani plotline, where Chapter 11, I think, is another Aviendha POV. Aviendha, this is kind of continuing what we were talking about in the previous Aviendha POV, where she's doing some of these menial tasks for the Wise One as punishments for something that she doesn't understand. She doesn't know why she's being given this punishment, and Chapter 11 sees her still doing some of this stuff, carrying heavy stones across camp in particular. On one particular stop of doing this, a guard complains of being a little bit hot, despite the day actually being a little bit cooler than normal, so Aviendha is a little bit confused by that. The other guard that is there is a little bit confused by it. He is initially dismissed until he literally bursts into flames and melts, hardening into obsidian, another bubble of evil event. And this burst of flames basically causes the scene that is in the thumbnail of the video, in the actual video itself, the background on the cover of the book. That burned out hole there is caused by the burst of fire and flames that this guard that literally melts to death experiences. And so Aviendha actually does some work to try to stop this. The dead guard has caused this fire to the building. Aviendha channels to stifle the fire a little bit, eventually aided by another Ashaman until it is out. And apparently Aviendha is able to control like a pretty substantial amount of a nearby stream in order to actually do that. And it's pretty impressive to some of the wise ones. One of the wise ones actually, kind of compliments Aviendha about this. She exhausted herself with how much channeling and how much of the power that she actually had to use in order to, use the water to stop this fire. But yeah, that leaves her exhausted. Rand appears. He rants to the Dark One about the bubbles of evil because he's upset about it, and then he disappears again into the building. And afterwards, a wise one actually comes and approaches Aviendha, like I said before, and asks her thoughts on Rand, kind of randomly, and she answers about it, but then she's dismissed to go to her beds because of her exhaustion, but is also told that she will have more punishments coming the next day for not completing the task with moving stones, and this kind of continues to upset Aviendha. But again, this kind of thread with the punishments and stuff, in next week's reading, we will see, or next week's diary, we will see what this actually comes to, because it's some pretty cool stuff. But I believe that's like all of the Rand and Aviendha, Cadsuane, all of the Eredamon plotline stuff for this week's reading. So let's revert back over to we already covered chapter 7 and chapter 6. So we're going to cover chapters 8 and 11, I think. Sorry, no, 8 and 12. That'll be more of the White Tower stuff, and then there will be one final miscellaneous POV after that. So chapter 8 returns us to the kind of White Tower political stuff going on, except instead of in the White Tower with Egwene, it is now a Siuan Sanche POV in the rebel Aes Sedai camp. In Egwene's absence, Siuan tries to keep Lelaine specifically from usurping her authority, because it does seem like Lelaine and Ramonda are kind of at heads, like trying to see if Egwene does not come back, which one of these two will kind of implicitly be the one who's raised to Amyrlin. Lelaine seems to be basically trying to make that claim already, even though Egwene is still alive. There's nothing wrong with that. But Lelaine is trying to, in some sense, usurp her authority, and this bothers Siuan a good bit. But she also keeps her debt to Gareth Bryne, specifically from being transferred to Lelaine. Lelaine tries to convince Siuan that, like, hey, you don't need to be doing this thing. Like, I would, she knows that Siuan and Egwene were close, and she tries to tell Siuan's like, hey, I can take your debt away from him. I can convince that will be okay. You'll just, be in some form of service to me. And Siuan's like, she kind of sees through this. She sees through this guise and understands that that's kind of what the implication is, and instead is able to convince Lelaine that her being able to keep an eye on Gareth Bryne as the general of the rebel army is actually probably a good thing politically for the Aes Sedai. She has vested interest in doing this because she does feel herself falling in love with Gareth, so that's a pretty interesting thing going on. That's happening, but in order to keep herself from having to do the chores from Gareth, even though she doesn't actually mind it that much as she claims she does convince Lelaine that, hey, if I can keep an eye on the general, that's actually politically a pretty good thing, so let's keep with that, right? And Lelaine actually agrees. Speaking of Gareth Bryne, Siuan does go to his tent, and finally actually lets loose about why she broke her oath to him, because back several books ago, when she and Leanne were able to escape the White Tower, and then they were just trying to survive, there was a point where, Siuan had oaths that she had sworn to Gareth to serve him to some degree, and she broke the oath. She ran away because she needed to take care of, like, Egwene and the rebel Aes Sedai and, like, move on and do this whole thing. And Gareth Bryne was like, wait a minute, so why did you break the oath? And he followed Siuan, and his promise was like, I will continue to be involved with this. I'll continue to basically follow you until you actually answer this question. Why did you do that? I will not leave until I have that answer. Or rather, he's able to force her to do service for him. This is why she serves him and does, like, laundry and stuff for him, is because the agreement was, you will continue to do this and I will not release you from this service. I will not say that your debt is paid until you answer this question. And he asks her again in this chapter, and she finally lets loose about it. She actually answers him. She says that it was in service to a bigger oath that she had sworn before the oath to him, and because he did not actually insist upon a specific timeline for her oath to him, that meant that she had to take priority the bigger oath, the prior oath, the more directly important oath, and that was, going to support the Dragon Reborn. So she admits all of this to him. She's not entirely sure why she does, but she does it. And then he also has sussed out her habit of basically meeting Egwene. He doesn't know about Tel'aran'rhiod specifically, but he does know that Siuan has a habit every few nights of going to bed early, and that this probably has something to do with how she's able to get information from Egwene. So this is also the night that she is supposed to do that, and Brian lets her do that. So the rest of the chapter, the end of the chapter, is Siuan meeting Egwene in Tel'aran'rhiod, informing her of some of the information that we got from, was that last book? Was that book 11 where it was revealed that Halima was that Delana was a dark friend and that Halima was Forsaken? Delana would be dark, not just a dark friend, straight up Black Aja at that point, but that Halima was a Forsaken and that Halima uses Sidon. I think that reveal happened in book 11. It might have happened in book 10 at this, but no, it was in book 11 because Egwene was not in the camp. Duh. So that was in the last book when that reveal happens, and Siuan actually conveys this information to Egwene in the chapter. It's just like, hey, this happened, and Egwene is pretty, concerned about that, considering the fact that Halima was the one that would heal Egwene's headaches, but once Egwene was captured and locked in the White Tower, she stopped having the headaches in the first place. She now understands that because Halima was using Sidon, and therefore she couldn't feel the channeling that way, that Halima must have been the one that killed the Aes Sedai women who were killed in the camp over the last couple of books, and more importantly, that the reason that she was relying so much on Halima was because she was basically forced to. Halima was the only solution to this problem that Halima himself was creating. So there was all of that going on. Siuan also informs Egwene a little bit about some of Lelane's advances, her implicitly trying to usurp Egwene's authority, and Egwene basically says that it's fine, like, let her continue to do this thing, because I am going to come back at some point, like, there's not going to be a time when I just don't, I'm not going to die here or whatever, and she also says that Lelane's actions of, like, trying to usurp Egwene's authority is actually, it's like trying to usurp her authority by using it for her own ends. It's just like, hey, remember what Egwene said about this or about this, like, I'm supporting the Amyrlin Egwene, haha, kind of in a tongue-in-cheek kind of way, or rather to serve her own purposes. And Egwene's just like, yeah, but her doing all of that actually supports me, so when I do come back, Lelane will have spent all of that time supporting me, which gives me more legitimacy. And so, Egwene seems pretty seriously political here. Siuan notices in this chapter that, like, man, Egwene has really come into her own as an Amyrlin already, despite her youth, like, and that's pretty cool. But now we're going to jump to chapter 12, which is returns to an Egwene POV in actuality, and Egwene is called upon by various sisters, kind of like I talked about from the previous time we had something like this happening, which is, I think, chapter 2, where she was, talking with some basically the setup of, like, her trying to get the various different Ajas to talk to each other, and trying to, subtly sow seeds of, like, hey, this is stuff that's going on in the tower, this is important to note and, to worry about, basically. She is doing a lot of this in chapter 12, and it's actually a pretty good climactic moment to end the first week's reading and to end this diary on. So let's just go into the rest of it here. Egwene is called upon by various sisters. One person that she meets with in the chapter is a yellow Aja member, and more importantly is a sitter of the yellow Aja. This meeting is to address, like, hypothetical problems involving basically themselves, like the yellow sister and some of the other people who call Egwene to attend them and to give lessons. They use these opportunities to ask Egwene questions, like they might ask an Amyrlin, for example, or just kind of hypotheticals like, hey, I'm definitely not in this situation, but what would you do if you were in this situation? But, Egwene is able to read through it and be like, these women are asking me questions about how to deal with their situations as if they're addressing an Amyrlin. And so she does that, and she is encouraged to join various different Ajas as a result of this. In this particular case, meeting with the yellow sitter says, you would make a good yellow, so you should consider doing that when you are able to be raised to an Aja. And she's like, yeah, but the Amerlin doesn't have an Aja. And the yellow sitter's response is basically, yeah, but an Amerlin is raised from an Aja, so you should consider the yellow. So like there's a little bit of legitimacy and respect given to Egwene by this sitter, for example. She is given no punishments for the way that she talks to the sitter in this moment, and the similar thing kind of happens in a couple of other cases. She's given no punishments for the way she talks to these women, and these women talk about her in a confidential way, in a respectful way, generally speaking, and like asking legitimate questions. So you can tell that Egwene is making progress, and in all of these cases, she recommends that these sisters go about and, yeah, just try to interact with the other Ajas, be seen together, make efforts in this way, heal the tower implicitly by going to dinner with other people. Like just do this will help to heal the tower. And these sisters agree to do so because they kind of see the utility of that task. And finally, this takes us into basically the last scene of chapter 12, and it's Egwene going to visit Miodani. Miodani does call upon Egwene. She does go there and discovers that Miodani can't leave the White Tower. She had asked her, it's like, hey, you're discovered, basically. You know that Elaida knows. Elaida knows that you know that she knows. Why have you not left? Like, it's crazy that you haven't left the tower at this point. And Miodani basically says she can't. She can't leave the tower. Why can't she leave the tower? Well, good question. She can't say, because again, Miodani and some of the other spies from the Rebel Aes Sedai camp have been forced upon the Oath Rod to swear, maybe not fealty, but basically to obey a few of the sitters of the Ajas that have like been trying to weed out the spies of the tower. In over the last few books, we've had a few of the Aes Sedai in the tower like discover that there were rebels about, and trying to discover them, and also trying to discover who might be Black Aja, dealing with all of these issues and looking about and saying, hey, maybe we should like deal with this, right? And so Miodani is one of these people who has been given this task. Is like she has to obey, and one of those things is like she can't leave the tower, basically. But she can't say that. So Egwene is like, okay, so how are we going to figure this out? And Miodani says that she can show her instead, and this actually works out. So Egwene teaches Miodani how to make a gateway, having her promise to not show anybody how to do that, not know that she knows how to do it, not know that she knows how to travel. But Miodani now knows how to travel, and she is able to take them to the bottom of the tower with the gateway, where there are various of these sitters of various different color Ajas, like I said before, that are meeting. And Egwene is able to make headway with all of these women as well, convincing them to put effort into uniting the tower a little bit, given Elaida's illegitimate position as Black Aja. This scene was actually really great political like conversation going on. The women are pretty upset with Miodani for showing Egwene down here. It's like, you promised that you wouldn't tell anybody about these meetings. And it's just like, yeah, but you didn't say I couldn't show you. And Miodani seems to agree that Egwene is the rightful Amerlin seat, and everybody's able to acknowledge that, like, hey, or Egwene's able to, like, piece things together. It's like, okay, so you admit that the Black Aja exists, and you guys are trying to weed out who might be Black Aja within the tower. They're like, yeah, we are doing that. And she's like, okay, cool. So, who have you discovered? And they realize that Elaida's vote to end up being raised to the Amerlin seat was a pretty tight one, and that she was able to get into the Amerlin seat by the bare minimum number of votes, but that one of those votes, at least one of those votes, was a Black Aja Aes Sedai, which implicitly invalidates her being Amerlin. And so she's able to get them to basically agree that, hey, Elaida's basically an illegitimate Aes Sedai, so like, we should all be working together here. She makes great political headway in this chapter, and that chapter was just really fun. There are more great Egwene chapters to come, but all of that will be in next week's reading. We'll talk about one final chapter to close off this diary today. That will be chapter 9, and that is because chapter 9 is a Perrin POV chapter, and it's one of the few Perrin POV chapters in this book entire, so we'll just close off with this kind of miscellaneous thing going on. Perrin is basically just repairing some wagons while taking petition from some of his people and from some of the refugees that they freed from Malden, because they want to leave, and they can't all just travel. The Ashaman that are with Perrin are too weak, they're too tired, they're too exhausted to be able to just travel a bunch of people out, so they need to move. And so one thing he is doing is he's having people prepare to move. And that includes, using wagons. So he's preparing a wagon and in the midst of the time taking petition from people because he's basically the leader of this entire encampment. And so they want to petition him as a leader regarding some issues that they have. So he does this in this chapter. Some of these petitions include a question about like why all the Shido wise ones were handed to the Shanchan instead of allowed to be questioned and studied. This is a question from one of the Aes Sedai, and he says that like, hey, it's not really my issue. Like, that was the agreement, so that's how it is. He's also questioned about not allowing Queen Oleandre specifically to be allowed to travel out ahead of everyone else just to keep the queen specifically safe. And he uses that excuse of, hey, the Ashaman are just too tired. Stop asking me. We're all going to travel away, and then we're going to wait a few weeks or however long it takes for the Ashaman to be not so exhausted so that we can all travel somewhere else together in general, right? Then he gets petition from Tam al'Thor, of course, Rand's father, and Tam informs Perrin of moves that he's personally making for the group to, be able to be underway to leave Malden together. And he also offers Perrin some advice to keep the Wolf banner and maybe even the Manetheren banner up, because they're good for morale. These people that are following Perrin like believe in him and want to follow him, and getting rid of like the symbols of that leadership would be kind of a silly thing to do. It would kind of like reduce his own legitimacy. So like he's like, as a leader you should keep these banners. And Perrin, he doesn't like necessarily refuse. He considers it a little bit, but he argues it a little bit. But this is something that Perrin continues to argue with himself about, even in the couple other scenes that appear in the book, is him like trying to come to terms with his own leadership position, basically. So there's that, and Perrin also learns in the end of the chapter that the Malden refugees are ready to move. He learns from somebody else that they're ready to go, and so he orders them all to go. He plans for basically everyone to march, like I mentioned before, for a few weeks just to get out of the area, because there are still some Shido Aiel from a different sept kind of like a day's march away. He wants to get away from them, to indicate like, hey, I don't want to fight you, like we're leaving. So he wants them all to march. He plans to march for a few weeks until the Ashaman is strong enough to actually transport them away. And that chapter was actually really good. I kind of mentioned earlier about how Brandon Sanderson kind of just understands these characters. Every one of these characters that he explored in this week's reading, at least, spot on. So spot on, in fact, that I think he actually understands a couple of these characters better than Robert Jordan came to. I suggested that. I made that blasphemy earlier. Brandon Sanderson understands Perrin better than Robert Jordan did. He wrote Perrin better in this chapter than Robert Jordan has since book 4 of the series. Just very good stuff, handled very well. Maybe part of this is because Jordan did not have very many notes for Perrin, so Brandon has basically had to come up with ways to deal with it all himself. And furthermore, because Perrin was/is Brandon's favorite character of the series, so he probably had some personal vested interest in actually handling that character well. But yeah, that Perrin chapter was pretty good, and the other Perrin chapters that occur here are also really good, because Sanderson really understands that character, but he understands all of them quite well up to this degree, in my opinion. I've never during this first week's reading, in the prologue or the first 12 chapters, never once did I feel like, oh, I'm not sure Brandon really did a very good job with that, or did I ever feel like taken out of the story because a character was off or something like that. The whole entire time, everything just worked. It really has worked for me, and I'm very happy with this book so far. But that is going to be the end of the first diary. This video is way longer than I wanted it to be, quite frankly, and that was only the first quarter of the book. So yeah, we will be back next week, and I will cover chapters 13 through 26. Then I'm going to be recording that video today as well, so that video will come out next week, and then we'll see where the chapter splits for the last couple diaries at some point after that. Thank you guys so much for watching this diary. I hope that my excitement for this book has come through. I'm really enjoying it so far. Let me know what you think about it, and what you think about some of my interpretations of stuff. I definitely put a little bit more of my own personal commentary in this than I feel like I have in a lot of diaries up to this point. And that's because there's been a lot more to say. I've been really into this. In fact, every morning that I've been reading this book over the past week, basically, I've spent like an hour or two after I've been done reading, thinking to myself about why this book is working for me more than the last few have. Why this book clicks, where the last few have been like kind of tedious and stuff like that. I've been talking to myself about that, even like kind of preempting a full series review, for example, like the way that I'm going to have to talk about the different arcs and various different elements of stuff going on, and the way that that all converses with itself. And I've been having even an enjoyable time just doing that, you know, where with the last couple books, some of those have been rants. These last few days have been like excitement because of this book, you know, so it's really good. I'm really enjoying myself. But again, I will cover quarter 2 of the book and get up to the halfway point next week. And I hope to see you guys there. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.